I will just let the participants be able to comment on each other's talks before we open the floor to the public. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions myself. But is there anything immediately you want to comment on each other's? Please.
Maybe not directly, but triggered by what you said about secularism. Because I think I did a year ago or two. I did some, not very scientific perhaps, but I just thought that why do people consider secularism a good thing in political terms? And I think that one of them is that because secularism means that because you don't like the thought of a group saying that Allah or God or had said that it should be like this, and the Sharia is the law of the land, it cannot be discussed, and some people sort of claim the right to speak in the name of God and therefore to dominate. That is at least part of the argument for secularism. Problem is that, and then I looked at the etymology of the word secularism, found sort of, and it's sort of this thing that secular, it means in time, as opposed to God, which is outside of time. So this thing which is in time, secular, is somehow things that can be discussed, that people can deal with, people can decide on. And then I thought, okay, if that's the argument, then so what then if the one saying that, not that God had said so, and I know what God thinks, and therefore it must be like this, but it just says, I have the biggest gun, and because of that, you must do like me. Is that secularism? And now to round up some historical problem with secularism, I'm not anti-secular in any way, but the historical problem with secularism in the Middle East, it came somehow in that way. Someone with the gun said, like Ataturk in his time, and Reza Shah in Iran, and so on. And so well, it's not easy to give advice, but it didn't go the long way via arguing with the people and getting the people to want secularism.
This is what I wanted to comment about. The problem that we are now in defensive corner because most of the time that secularism comes from outside enforced by dictatorship. And this is not a scenario that you can sit together with an ally, even if he is an Islamist, to discuss over a country future. Because right now, what happened, especially like with Sisi, is a nightmare. They are going through Hafiz al-Assad. So this is not, as a secular, I don't want it to go there. I don't want it to be enforced. Yeah, it's short. In the short term, I will have an amazing secular. Later on, he's gonna arrest me. Later on, like 5 years, the one dictator who is so secular, who is really proud about secularism, he will arrest me for a blog post that I wrote about something. And that's totally what's happened with Egypt. So we should accept democracy even if the result didn't really our team. This is the challenge in the Middle East. If democracy brought the wrong people, we should keep democracy. We get rid of the wrong people in the next term of democracy. But not, the problem is, immediately we jump into conclusion. Let's get rid of democracy. The Middle Easternians fighting of each other. Let's bring them one good ruler who can put them in place. And obviously they are not putting in place is not working anymore.
Well, I had a quick remark about what something Bjorn Olaf said. You said these regimes are able to exploit tensions because they already exist. Sometimes it's true, but they also create a great deal of things that did not exist. I mean, I just gave an example with the settlement of Arab tribes among the Kurds. That's something they basically created for. And if you look also at the spatial/sectarian organization of Damascus, for instance, where certain people were told to, establish themselves, and you have really like a manipulation of and creation of sectarian tensions that did not exist in the first place.
Kind of just very briefly. Yeah, I acknowledge that, but it's just but what I think is important is to say, because there's a danger the other way, because if you deny, if in general we would deny, we said this is just manipulated, then we might end up where, for example, I remember when Sadruddin Ibrahim in Egypt wanted to make a conference on minorities in Egypt and would discuss the Copts as a minority, he had to go to, it was a huge problem for him. He had to go to Cyprus, and even the Coptic Church denied. So everybody denied it. Now, if these things are being denied, you can, the result is discrimination, because, but without the discourse, but the
I'd like to use the opportunity for a question or two myself. The regime obviously always have framed any kind of Islamist opposition as sectarian and even potentially genocidal. If you look away from the actually genocidal Islamists like the Islamic State, what about more mainstream Islamist opposition, armed opposition, let's call it, in Syria today? Where do they stand? Are they being pushed in an increasingly more sectarian way, or are they by virtue of their Islamist credentials, so to speak, already sectarian? Or would you frame them as that? For instance, Thomas.
Okay. Well, if we look at the mainstream Islamism, people like the Muslim Brotherhood, if you look at their platform by 2010, I mean, there is no sectarianism in it. Okay, they want an Islamic State, want China, and so on, but they speak of equal citizenship for everyone and so on. 2 months ago, when there was the attempt, well, initially successful attempt at breaking the siege of Aleppo, the offensive was called after what is his name, Ibrahim Yusuf, or yeah. So who was an officer of the Syrian army who carried out a massacre of the artillery academy in 1979, where he killed dozens of Alawite cadets and targeted them, and separated the Alawites from the Sunnis. And among the groups who participated and promoted the operation under this name, you had, for instance, Fail al-Qasham, which is in a way related, or at least close to the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, that's another kind of discourse that's endorsed by the official Muslim Brotherhood, but you see clearly how certain groups have, but this is 5 years into this horrendous war and sectarian polarization, and it's not about credentials. It's not about what the ideology was 5 years ago. Yeah, ISIS was already there 5 years ago, of course. That's always been like this. But of course, there is radicalization in circumstances that are quite obvious.
It's not about radicalization only. It's about how you've been labeled all of the time as a Syrian. Like, to me, the women without hijab, Christian activist, like, I have really aspect that is attractive, but it's all the time on the table. The international community is putting it all the table. I've been invited to talk about as this. It's with Syrian relations, it is in the table. When you are crossing the border from Syria to Turkey, if you are crossing from Antakya, you should be worried if the officer is Alawite or not. So suddenly, your identity become more than your identity, become like you have something in your shoes and it's annoying you all the time. Sunni feel it all the time, Alawites feel, suddenly everyone is holding their identity really clear. And I think because people are discriminated based on it, or gain positive discrimination or bad like discrimination based on it, so everyone feeling defensive right now on the corner over their identity. I don't know if it's gonna last. But what we will do with Islamists in Syria, this is a question, I think it is a question on a daily basis, because if we manage to fall in the gap of making them the pure devil, they will come with the population always as the victim of suppressions. This is their main power in speech. They deal with themselves as the victims, they've spent years in jails in Syria, everyone tortured them. If we agreed on to making them in that corner, they're gonna win by sympathy. Syrians have a huge sympathy regarding torture, so they're gonna win because of sympathy. And we don't want them to win over sympathy. So we should look at them as allies. Yeah, we don't have the same we don't have the same project for Syria. But they are Syrians, they do exist, they should be protected over law, and we should deal with it. If we won, of course, and we have a secular. Obviously, I'm talking like we took the country and.
Before I open the floor for question, I'll just one more question before I'm done. In an interview I recently made with the Syrian philosopher Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, himself a staunch opponent of the regime, he criticized and now we already established that indeed sectarianism can be secular, haven't we? He criticized the opposition for not dealing seriously with sectarianism within its own ranks, for sweeping the problem under the carpet and perpetuating a myth, as he said, quote, good people about Syrians as quote, good people who had lived peacefully together since God created the earth, unquote. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? Where's that?
This is part of like, minority word is really right now a sensitive word in Syria, because the majority is paying the highest price and everyone is obsessed about talking minority protection. I think that minorities need a plan in Syria, and I think hiding this, it would be like romantically naive and like part of dealing the way the Bashar al-Assad dealt. We are Syrian, all of us, yeah, because all of us are suppressed. It's not like this. But the problem is when you focus that much about that topic while the majority is suffering, it's creating even those who believe in equal citizenship, talking about why when 500,000 martyrs, more than 90% of them are Sunnis, we are talking about the protection of Christians right now. So how you can make it as part of a national agenda in protecting humans in Syria, how you can address that, and I'm agreeing that the opposition is still having the romantic that we used to live together, and I'm coming from community doesn't believe that shit. When they read it, they will say, no, we didn't used to live together, we used to live in our lobby while we are scared from everyone else, and that's why we didn't really interact with anything. We dealt like we don't exist. Don't see us, don't deal with us, we are not here. So right now the problem is there's not enough inclusive approach in writing these papers. And why there's not enough? I'm really interested in protection of Christians in the future of Syria. Whenever there is like a tension, and I wanted to contact the church, because I'm like the priest's daughter, I used to be like a huge believer, going to church all my life. If I wanted to contact a church leader, it should be through a mediator. Both of us, we will travel to some European country to discuss secretly without Bashar al-Assad even knows. He's still kidnapping. They are still living in pre-2011. They are still doesn't represent themselves. They can't talk about their fears clearly and openly. So most of the time it's us talking about their fears, their issues, their problems, while they are out of the picture.
Thank you, Marcel. A couple of hand raisers already. I believe Jan Erik, you were first.
My name is Jan Erik Smeden. I'm a journalist and historian. Thank you for three very interesting presentations. But it was one topic I was missing, and that was the role of tribalism. As far as I have understood, a great deal of the older sheikhs are supporting the regime either by tradition, by alliances, or by fear. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the younger generation, they have broken their bands with their older leaders, and they have started their own militias, and consisting of their own tribal groups. So many of the different militias today in Syria is tribal, based on tribalism. And my question is, how do you see the role of the tribes and the clans today, and how do you see it in the future of Syria?
Who wants to take on that one? Thomas?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure you can say that it's a general matter among tribes. I mean, tribes in Syria are extraordinarily divided among all warring parties. And, you know, I don't remember who recently said, you know, tribes, they tend to follow, you know, the dominant, who's stronger militarily, who pays more, who leaves them alone. It can be anyone. So you see tribes, sometimes different branches of one same tribe. One, they have pledged allegiance to ISIS. Others, they're fighting with the Kurds, and others are still with the regime. And you have also sometimes, long-standing tribal rivalries which are exploited by either or one of the warring parties. So I think it's absolutely impossible to do any generalization about. I mean, the only generalization we can make is that they're very pragmatic. When they follow someone, it's never for ideological reason. It's because they will follow this warring party that can secure their interests in the most efficient way.
Lars, was it?
Yeah, just to repeat, I mean, Syrians must pick any government they want for my sake, but they can't. They have to do it themselves, not expect that we do it for them. And about Assad, you don't have to make him worse than he is. I mean, yesterday I heard someone comparing to Hitler twice. In fact, here comparing him to Hitler, and now I just hear genocidal. I mean, if Assad really had wanted to kill all his opponents, he could have done it 15 years ago. And speaking of secularism, as far as I know, there are lots of Sunnis, both in the army, in the parliament, in the government, and even Assad's wife is a Sunni. And it's not only.
So, excuse me, is
yeah.
that the question? So, or a comment?
Question.
I come to the question to open up for questions. Yes, please, just directly to the question.
Yes, the question is, the rebels, most of them are jihadists. They want to have Sharia and stuff. So how can you expect something good coming out of this?
Okay.
I leave that to Marcel.
That would be fun. Okay, why Syrians doesn't do that by themselves? As an activist, I used to naively believe that there is something so-called international solidarity that prevents crazy dictators from committing genocides in the modern world. Because committing genocide in the modern world will create something called radicalism, which is beyond Syria. We can agree it is beyond Syria. So if this logic, if I'm sitting with a Syrian and he said to me, why we should fight ISIS? I will tell them because it's a global problem. So it's the question why we should fight Assad, because also it's a global problem. It's easy like this, and not fighting them created what we are living right now. So we are in the bottom of it. So should we sit and say that there is Syria and there is the world? To me, I hate that approach. Because in that approach, I should believe like this is the word who let Syrians die, the devil word, and this is totally ISIS speech. No, to me this is the word who should understand the suffering of the Syrians, and together we should sit together to say like this planet is having polar of Islamophobes and polar of radical Islam. What is the solution? Let's find a solution together. This planet have dictatorship and people, and the UN is failing because it is state member mechanisms. Let's sit together to discuss how we can move furthermore. So later on, when Sisi gonna crush his people, he won't do it the Syrian way. When Iranian gonna crush their people, won't do it the Syrian way. So that's, to me, as a person who care a bit about this planet, unfortunately I do care about this planet, that's why it is not only a Syrian issue. So is Assad like crushing people, is he genocidal? If he wanted to kill everyone, he would have done it. He is doing it. If you are not watching enough, they said 7 million are out of the country. I'm one of the cursed who lived all the revolution. The first time I have like the same exact sense of like you're talking about, I was in the protest. We were shouting, one Syrian people are one, and we were really glad. Like in Syria, you didn't say Bashar al-Assad to your family. It is as holy as that. And suddenly you are in the street talking about Hafiz al-Assad. To this is like euphoria. Exactly, this is happiness. And they shot us. And I stood like this. They really shot us? Because hearing it and seeing it is totally different. Later on, I saw Scud missiles, I saw barrel bomb, I witnessed chlorine attacks, and yeah, he did all of that. So the problem is why he is able to do it now, in modern times, because people like you are staying in the background. But what if he didn't really do it? Let us debate human rights in 2016, and we still ask ourselves why Islamists do exist. They do exist because they are also debating the Holocaust. They are also debating human rights in 2016, but they are debating it without the suit and the nice stuff and in English. Thank you.
Anyone else? Floor is open. Yes, in the back, please.
The amazing parent with the kid. Can you come here?
Maybe you should.
I was trying to make them stay for an hour now. There's no more time. Now you sleep, and now I have a question. Hello, my name is Nisa. I'm originally from Syria, from Aleppo. I work as a filmmaker, and I have a question, a little bit of a statement maybe, or a question. I find it rather bemusing to witness that every time we are talking about minority, we talk about minority as something occurred yesterday, something just happened in Syria. And that, in a way, works to seed the debate regarding rehabilitating Assad as a co-partner in fighting terrorism. And at this point, I wonder if there's something wrong with our perception on the conflict, the Western, like as an insider, outsiders to the conflict of Syria. I wonder if there's a perception problem, if there's like somehow the information stream being tampered with on its way from Syria all the way to the pool of public opinion in the West. Thank you. And if so, what should be happening to correct that?
Thank you very much. Pirulo.
Perhaps a comment to that. I think two things. I think there's a general tendency, being an old leftist myself, remembering the good old days when we were supporting the Vietnamese against the US. But the strength in our sort of solidarity was also because we thought that Vietnam would be heaven or something like that, when the Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese won. I think that the challenge is to stick to your principle of solidarity when you have a more realistic understanding that it's not like that. It's not the dictatorship or heaven. There are lots of trouble if you look at every revolutionary movement in history, not least no, you're Belgian, right? Yeah. I was almost going to say
Thank
French.
you.
But you'll see how chaotic it was, how long time it took before things settled, and still. So that's one thing. Another thing, that in this particular case, I think it's fair to say that it's the question of Islamism has got a role in the Western perception of the Middle East, which is very negative in this sense, because there's this. However it happened, there's the result is a demonization of Islamism, and those people are on the offensive that draw an equation sign between Islamism is like jihadism is like ISIS. There are some small tactical differences, but the reality is, of course, totally different. The Muslim Brothers are not angels, but they are certainly a quite different kind of movement, and similar movements, which are broad popular movements, which have, if you are a secularist, certainly you'll have a lot of issues with them, but it's a different kind of setting, and there are, I think, many points of possible agreement for popular movements when they are able to bridge that divide. And some, in the best parts of the Arab Spring, there was coming together around certain simple demands, and that was it's never going to be easy. It's not going to be without fallouts and struggles. But it's I think that the challenge for the West, for people in the West and for governments in the West, is to stick to principle, to push. And in the case of Syria, for example, not supporting this or that armed group, perhaps, but it's a bit late now in the day, unfortunately. But to push, to put certain demands on the Assad regime, and based on principle of democracy, of human rights, and so on. And there are lots. There's a whole range of measures that could have been taken. Now it's things which should have been still have to be done. I'm glad I'm not a politician, but yeah, that's okay.
I think we should. There is two things are not addressed enough: how the West is dealing with us. To me, I feel the shock when I talk about Syria. People don't know that people like me do exist. To them, there is a victim woman who is like, I should look a certain way, talk a certain way, and otherwise they tell me like, and sometimes they consider it like a good comment. You don't look like a Syrian. And I'm like, okay, how a Syrian looks like, because I lived my whole life in Syria. I'm not like the Syrian or European. No, I'm the Syrian. That's it, full stop. And I keep hearing it. And I think this orientalization and seeing us from above is still going on. And added value Islamophobic to this. So you have the amazing. So right now when you hear the solution, unfortunately I'm meeting high officials a lot. And the solution is divide them. This barbaric Middle East, they don't know how to live together. Give Alawists a space, give Sunnis a space. And in their solution, I don't exist. Where do I live in this solution? I don't know. I keep looking at it, and most people I know won't find themselves in such scenario. But it is like they consider it the smartest idea. Look how we fought ISIS, and the problem is the states are dummy. Exactly, there's no lesson learned. They dealt with ISIS for Iraq, like bring Shia dictators to try to attack ISIS. Right now ISIS is bigger and bigger and bigger, and no one's sitting to talk how we reached that point. Why we are failing in Iraq that much. So the leftists, okay, it's intervention. Obviously it's intervention, and others don't, okay, America don't admit they do mistakes, they don't, yeah. So this is again and again, and I'm seeing it happening again in Syria, and I'm like, really, you're gonna do this again? So what we're gonna see after ISIS? What is the next creature? Because compared to Qaeda, ISIS is like, Qaeda would be really, really comic book. And I don't know, like right now we are looking so advanced. So what is the next creature that we're gonna face? No one is asking, because it's not a global problem anymore. No one is dealing with it, as we are allies here to solve a problem that's gonna cause global problem in the future.
Yes, one more, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. My name is Khulud, and I'm from Syria. And I have a few comments on what Marcel actually said, just reflection, being Syria and how, and then a question to Thomas. And I'll try to be very, very brief. And actually, I find it very problematic how the international community deals not only with the Syrian conflict, but also like with the Middle East in general, because it's often very easy to see the Middle East from a sectarian lens. Like it's always easier, just like when you launch in geopolitics, to analyze the Syrian conflict or what's happening in the Middle East from a pure sectarian lens. And also to bring this dichotomy of majority minority, which also like if I'm not mistaken, it was also brought during the French mandate or a little bit earlier to the region. It didn't even exist like this notions of majority minority, so it was brought actually to the Middle East during the French mandate. About the Syrian identity crisis, which I very much share with Marcel, and I think why we as Syrians who had lived all our lives in Syria, where we had in our imagination that we live in this, like social cohesion and fabric and all of these things, because I think we were oppressed, that we couldn't discuss religion in politics. Like we couldn't even utter the word Alawite or utter the word Ikhwan, like even pronouncing those words were like would be considered as a crime. So and suddenly we discovered each other as Syrians. So we have, I think, like both. We have the legitimacy to both feelings, because in the sense we want to believe that we live in coexistence, but in reality we don't. So we have these contradictions all the time. And one thing also about secularism versus Islamism in Syria, and I think as secular somehow did not succeed to actually have inclusive approach. Like, for example, if I consider myself a secular person, sometimes I find it much easier to have a dialogue with some conservative or religious, because I can see that they are open-minded, like they can be more open-minded, they can be more, like inclusive to anything, while sometimes seculars would go to the very, very extremes, and for them, like rejecting everything regarding Islamism. Or Islam in general, not Islamism. So this is also, I think, we need also to talk more how to address these things, what secular really means. Does it mean just to deny Islam? Does it mean like not to have any conversation? And I will jump very quickly to my question, sorry. And I read your book twice, Thomas, and I really liked it a lot, but if you can just tell us, why do you think, and you talked a lot about the co-optation between the Assad regime and the so-called the so-called moderate Islam. And why do you think, for example, especially in Damascus, and we know the security situation there is like much more horrendous than probably other cities, why do you think they failed, like Kaftaro Foundation or the Qubaysiyat? Why did they fail, other than the security reasons? Why didn't they fail to actually join the Syrian revolution? Especially that they have the leverage on the ground and Assad regime really need them. So, if you just reflect. Thank you.
Should I address it now? Okay. So your question is, why did these networks fail to join the revolution? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. I mean, first, let's remember that there are very significant religious figures from Damascus, downtown Damascus, who joined. And actually, the more respected people left. Because you have the powerful people, the one who controls, religious schools, and they have, financial means and so on, like the Kaftaro or Farfur family. But they're not the one who commands the most, significant popular respect. I mean, the most respected people, they were like Kraim Rajih, who is the sheikh of the readers of the Quran, or Sheikh Usama Rifai. They're gone, these people. And even if you look at the, regime allies, sometimes you even have some division. There are people from the Kaftaro network, from the Fatah Institute, which was the other big religious institute in Damascus, who actually sided with the revolution. And what usually is that these people who are in downtown Damascus, who run the institutions, well, they've remained there. They have some stakes to take care of. And very often people in the suburbs of Damascus who've just followed the movement there, sometime even joining armed groups or, yeah. I don't know if I addressed your question. Yeah.
So we have, you took the turn, there was one last
I just wondered, we're looking at Syria and we're wondering about what's happening inside the country, but I'm a bit worried about the outside forces with the neighbors. It's rather complicated. The Wahhabis have their own interests. Iran, Turkey's crossed the border already. You're on the border of Iraq. With all these forces, where's the future? Are these people going to leave you alone to find your own future? Or are you going to be stuck in the middle of this? I think that's a very sore point actually. I find it hard to see your neighbours just leave
Yeah,
you
the
alone
problem when
to find your own
yeah.
future.
Not only our neighbors, like right now we are talking about Soviet Union coming back to
Well,
power.
the big powers are-
Imagine where we are. Like imagine what we are like backward in history, like to ages I didn't even imagine that I'm gonna be living to see. But when we were students and they used to taught us how Syria is lucky because she's like the middle of I don't know where in the planet and all the roads come from Damascus. No, I don't think they're gonna leave us alone. But also Syrians have upshown by now level of saying no for a lot of foreign projects. A lot. Right now Aleppo is besieged and it's bombed daily. We have 150 martyrs a day. And no one dared to have the joke, let Turkey take Aleppo. There's this joke and rumor like, let Turkey take Aleppo. And when you say it to Aleppian, they were like, no. This is not a funny joke, even in the sake of the joke of it. And right now we are in the worst case scenario. We won't see worst day for Aleppo. And there is still this feeling, now we wanted to live in Syria with Syrians and to decide with Syrians. Even when people talk about splitting, and there is a lot of tension, Syrians keep saying, no, we wanted to live in Syria. So we are trying to impose that. And how much I still believe on the people will, I don't know. Sometimes I doubt it. I doubt that the people will is enough to face all of these powers. But accepting the reality that everything is also in the hands of the great powers will end up by Syrians not trying to do anything to change it. We will accept that the Americans are the greater power and whatever they want, it's gonna happen. Also, it's not a healthy, yes? So I think it's kind of challenging. Like you are challenging the Islamists, you are challenging the main power, you have to challenge the state powers over Syria. And it won't, maybe I'm not gonna be living to see a sovereign Syria that is, but hopefully my kids will live in it, so I don't really know.
We will leave it at that on a positive note. So thank you so much to the panel. Great talks.